Welcome to this recording of the life of a 19th century gentleman with whom I seem to have been living alongside for about 3 months. You may recall at the end of Peter Elliott's recent talk on Plegmont, a reference was made to a gentleman who, when living in Chester in 1911, financed the refurbishment of the Archbishop's well at St Peter's Church at Plempstle. This was the church that served the people from Hoole for many centuries, until the building of All Saints took place in the latter half of the 19th century. The gentleman in question was Osborne Charles Vyse Aldis. But first, let me give you a little of his family background. Osborne's grandfather was Charles Aldis. Charles was the seventh son and one of 22 children of Daniel Aldis, a medical practitioner, and his wife, Mary Dix. Charles came to London from Norfolk in 1794 and studied at Guy's and Bartholomew's hospitals. In 1798, he was made surgeon to the sick and wounded prisoners of war at Norman Cross Barracks, Huntingdonshire, where from approximately 12,000 French and Dutch prisoners were detained. In 1800, he moved to Hertford, where he introduced vaccination into 3 parishes, in spite of opposition from local doctors. In 1802, he began practicing in London, and the following year became a member of the College of Surgeons. He was a surgeon to the new Finsbury Dispensary and founded a special hospital called the Glandular Institution for the Cure of Cancer in Clifford Street, London. For his valuable contribution to medical literature, some tomes he touted around London, he obtained his knighthood. He was dubbed by the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, but alas not via the proper channels, and not with the wishes or authorization of the king. In fact, it is reported that he was accused of having tricked the king. And it's also reported that he had the name Quack Quack shouted after him in the street, which is a term I recently learned comes from the Dutch word quacksalver, a peddler who sold drugs of a dubious nature. His wife, however, wasted no time in proclaiming herself a dame. Osborne's father, Charles James Berridge Aldis, also became a physician, but kept his feet firmly on the ground, and according to his biographer, became known as an efficient and painstaking officer of health who forsook the temptation of private practice, rather working for the poor and socially excluded. He became noted for his contribution to the Workshops Regulation Act. He was an active member of the College of Physicians and clearly a man of scholarship and culture. In 1859, he was selected to deliver the Harveian Lecture in Latin at the Royal College of Physicians. This was a yearly lecture held on the feast of St. Luke the Physician that was instituted in 1656 by William Harvey, discoverer of the systematic circulation. Until 1865, the oration was in Latin, as Harvey had specified, but it was thereafter spoken in English. And just before we leave this man, a cutting from the City Press, December 1866, reads, "A testimonial consisting of a handsome silver goblet with a purse of 100 sovereigns was presented to Dr. Aldis by F. Farr, M.D., Censor of the Royal College, on behalf of the doctor's professional friends and neighbours, as well as several philanthropic noblemen and gentlemen." Now, I must return to the main subject of my talk, which is who is Osborne Aldis. He was born in 1843 at Old Burlington Street, London, and educated at St Paul's School, London, and then at Gonville and Caius College, Cambridge. He was a Greek scholar at Cambridge, and on leaving with an MA in 1868, he decided not to follow 3 of his ancestors into medicine, but to pursue his own rather different career. In 1871, he had a daughter, Christina, with a certain Jane Chown, who hailed from Frome. Osborne's name was expunged from the child's birth certificate, but in March 1873, he did marry the girl's mother. They had two further daughters, Rose, born in 1873 at St Albans, and Ellen, born the following year at Seend in Wiltshire. To his intense grief, however, Jane died the following year at Cambridge House, Westbury-on-Trim, near Bristol. She was 23. At this time, thanks mainly to a family connection, Osborne was employed as manager at the Seend Ironworks. The Devizes and Wiltshire Gazette reports in 1873, "We are pleased to observe that the work is again resumed and the furnaces are heated to full blast. It is fortunate that the estate and ironworks are in the possession of Richard Berridge, Esquire, a partner in the firm of Henry Muir and Company, the London brewers. The management of the works of over 200 men is under the direction of Mr. Osborne Aldis. While there, along with two brothers, surnamed Hyde, Osborne invented and patented an improved form of alarm device for detecting inflammable gaseous substances in mines. By 1875, however, he had left and his post had been taken by his pupil assistant, Oliver Kimber, who at the demise of the company a short time later managed to purchase the land upon which the factory had been situated. Osborne's father, Charles, died suddenly in 1872 of heart disease. His mother, Emily, died in 1876. Emily, born in Barbados, had been a wealthy woman, owning property in England and a share in the Bromefield estate, which was a sugar plantation at St Lucy in the West Indies. That was begun by her father, the Reverend John Brome. 5/8 of her legacy was left to Osborne, which totalled many thousands of pounds. Osborne was apparently overwhelmed with his newfound wealth and began a spending spree. According to the Westminster Rate Books of 1878 to 1881, he purchased houses at 86 Eaton Place, 2 Chesham Place, 8 Lowndes Mews, and 21 Norfolk Street, Hanover Square. As you can imagine, they were properties in the upstairs-downstairs price range. Incidentally, the Westminster Rate Books comprise over 10 million names of taxpayers from the early 17th century to the end of the 19th century and are an excellent census substitute. In 1878, Frances Aldis was born in Torquay, her mother not listed. In 1879, Osborne Jr. was born in Marylebone, again, mother not listed. In 1880, Charles was born in Richmond. The name of the mother is listed as Chown. That confirms the suspicion and is proved in a later documentation that Osborne is cohabiting with Fanny Chown, his late wife's sister, and has had 3 children by her. It wasn't until 1907, with the Deceased Wife's Sisters Act of Parliament, that a widower could marry his late wife's sister. And in 1881, the census lists all members of the family, including Fanny, aged 25, and they were all assisted by a cook and a servant. They were living at Riverdale House, Richmond upon Thames, and properties there today are valued about 5.3 million. George Aldis was born in 1882. In 1883, it was reported in the Western Gazette and in many papers around the country that the Library of St Paul's School, London, which already possesses a copy of Milton's Paradise Lost, autographed by Robert Burns, has just had an addition made to its store of Milton literature by the gift of a first edition of Paradise Lost, 1669, and Paradise Regained in 1671. The donor was a former pupil, Mr. Osborne Aldis. By 1884, Osborne, having sold those expensive properties, had become the proprietor of the Wellington Club, Grosvenor Place. It is pictured today in Jermyn Street, frequented by the great and good of male society. It was often frequented in the mid-20th century by this man, and we wonder what became of him. One newspaper article shortly after the club's opening reported a fracas at the premises, but was quick to defend the proprietor's reputation. Mr. Aldis is a gentleman of the highest integrity, a man well known. In 1886, however, things began to turn sour. Press cuttings read, at the Old Bailey, Friday the 7th of May, Osborne Aldis, described as a gentleman, pleaded guilty to uttering a forged power of attorney to transfer a certain share and interest in the sum of £1,953, then standing in the names of Reverend Henry Cardwell and Reverend William Bramston, with intent to defraud the Bank of England authorities. Mr. H.D. Green, QC, and Mr. Poland prosecuted, and Mr. Besley appeared for the prisoner. The accused had a life interest in the money, and desiring to realise the amount, he obtained the consent of one of the trustees, and the power of attorney was prepared. The prisoner was to deposit a life policy in the Sun Insurance Office. Reverend Bramston, however, declined to sign the document, and the prisoner attached the Reverend's name to the document, and the amount was realised. In defence, it was urged that the prisoner had taken a club in Grosvenor Street and had furnished it with an expense of £16,000. When the landlord, and that was most probably the Duke of Westminster, distrained for the first half year's rent of £1,750, the result was that the furnishers and others reclaimed the properties they had provided for the premises. Witnesses were called to character, and the recorder postponed the sentence. At the Old Bailey on Saturday, May the 18th, 1886, Osborne Aldis, who had pleaded guilty to forging a power of attorney with the intent to defraud the Bank of England, was sentenced to 18 months in prison at Holloway Prison for hard labour. The recorder remarking that but for some mitigating circumstances, a much heavier sentence would have been passed. It is assumed that the recorder was referring to the welfare of Osborne's 7 children, 3 daughters, Rosie, Ellen and Frances, and they were all at Manila Hall, a convent in Clifton, which is part of Bristol, while the eldest, Christina, you may remember, was working as a governess to the Andre family in Chatham in Kent. Meanwhile, Osborne's 3 sons were boarders at a Catholic school in the upscale district of Bathwick in Bath. It is pleasing to note here that in spite of their father's future escapades, all 4 girls found settled employment in later life. Rose in 1901 was a nurse at the West Ham Union Infirmary. In 1911, Ellen was a sick nurse to a family in Chelsea, and Frances also became a nurse in Bristol. Shortly after his release from prison, Osborne was lodging at Rodney Cottages, Clifton, near Bristol, and in 1892 he moved to 2 Royal Park, Clifton, and where alas, quote, the official receiver's report, with a debtor who owes a total of £3,000, who has no occupation, states that he does not consider he is insolvent and that tangible assets consists of a small quantity of furniture only. It is possible a substantial sum may be derived from his interest in his undermentioned properties, a valuable contract for the purchase of certain mills, equity in the redemption of the house at 2 Royal Park, reversion to a moiety of a sum of £5,000 on the death of his sister, a maiden lady, now aged 53. She actually died in Kensington in 1905, aged 70. An intention of making an offer of composition has been expressed by the debtor, but up to the present moment none has been submitted. Mr. Hooper was appointed trustee with a committee of inspection. The Clifton and Redland Free Press published, by order of the Sheriff of Bristol, an auction of furniture, property of Osborne Aldis, take place on May the 10th, 1892. In August, the public examination in bankruptcy of Osborne Aldis of number 2 Royal Park Clifton Gentleman has been closed. The London Gazette, September 1893, gave notice that the Board of Trade was removing Alfred Humphrey Hooper from the office of trustee of the property of Osborne Aldis, a bankrupt. If the date shown on the later census form is to be believed, Osborne married his sister-in-law Fanny Maria Chown in 1895. Under ecclesiastical law, a marriage within the prohibited degrees was not absolutely void, but it was voidable at the suit of an interested party. Silence and secrecy, therefore, was advised. What happened to Osborne during the following 11 years will soon become clear. In 1906, Osborne bounced back into society and attended the fashionable wedding at St James's Church, Cheltenham, of a Dr Conyngham Affleck of Castle Douglas, Scotland, to Miss Elizabeth Burgess of Orkney. Both met while working at the Cheltenham General Hospital. Mr Osborne Aldis attended, was on the present list, and presented the couple with a silver sugar spoon. And then, oh dear. On the 24th of April the following year, quote, a receiving order in bankruptcy was made in the Cheltenham County Court against Osborne Charles Vyse Aldis on his own petition. The statement of affairs regarding the gentleman shows gross liabilities of £694 17 and sixpence, of which £259 17 and sixpence is unsecured, owing to 7 creditors. In fact, it turned out to be 12 creditors. He also bought some groceries on tick on his way to court. 3rd of May, Cheltenham Bankruptcy Court. The first meeting of the creditors of Osborne Aldis, gentleman of the Crippets, Whitcomb, was held before the official receiver, Mr Charles Scott. Let us look in at the bankruptcy court before Mr Charles Scott, the official receiver, and of course Osborne Aldis, gentleman. 7th of April, the following year. The Cheshire Observer had 2-column articles written by Osborne entitled A History of the Suffragettes, where he cites and champions the major contribution of women to various societies from ancient times to his modern day. He mentions the Gauls and Britons, especially Egyptians, so renowned for their learning, and when all civil duties were fulfilled by women. He concludes, in another decade, when the priesthood is ruffling its wings in the face of disestablishment, the views of Plato and Aristotle as regards the art of government and social rights of women and men may be acknowledged as in the days of the mighty past. And what is history but the revolution of thought with an evolution? Let us hope for betterment and the victory of pure ethics of social life over prejudices and those biased views which tend to crush national life and national intelligence. It's interesting to note that this was written in 1907, and women finally got the right to vote through law in 1918 and 1928. In 1908, again from the Cheshire Observer, the Chester Courant says it is a matter of congratulation to the residents of Chester that the question of the Combermere statue, raised by our correspondent Mr Osborne Aldis, has attracted the attention it deserves. It is hoped that the letter, to which among others the names of the Dean of Chester, Colonel Wilford Lloyd, Reverend Harold White, General Moretta, and Mr Gardner, appear as signatories, and they will sufficiently indicate the feeling of public opinion on the subject. When a work of art such as this statue has been erected as a memorial at a cost of several £1000s, it certainly does not reflect much credit or good taste on the authorities to whom its maintenance is entrusted, if it is allowed to become a mere target for roughs and from sheer neglect, to become conspicuous as an eyesore at the main entrance to Chester. May 30th, 1908. Sir, Grosvenor Park, as an example of landscape gardening, deserves every praise, and the scene is enhanced by the rich variety of rhododendrons. It would be very desirable, I might say imperative, that the lake should have immediate attention. It is suggestive at present as a miniature slough of despond. Between the gaps of stagnated crustaceans, it is very palpable, this little lake, which otherwise be a pleasing addition to the park. And it's almost choke full of slough and noxious matter. It has been in this condition for some months, and now that the hot weather has set in, would, I am sure, be condemned by the medical officer of health, should the spectre of German measles and scarlet fever appear to him in his moments of recreation. He, like other functionaries, cannot always be Argus-eyed. I'll say that again. He, like other functionaries, cannot always be Argus eyes, and I trust that he will use this hint as a public reminder to the keepers of the park of this ugly spot, which not only evinces neglect, but an absolute danger to the public health. And this was followed by a letter addressed to Farndon people, requesting they repair their churchyard, to seek out stonemasons or lend their gardeners for the task. The result would be a fitting tribute to the late lamented Reverend Owen, vicar of the parish. Apparently, Osborne knew him well. November 1908, we come full circle with the funding of the refurbishment of St Plegman's Well, the Plempstor Church, about which Peter talked last month, and which first introduced me to the name of Osborne Aldis Gentleman. Would that we could end this story with that good deed, but we must go on. May 1909, the instigator of the 1910 Chester pageant. The Birkenhead News, May 1909. When the holding of a Chester pageant was suggested a few years ago, the town council threw cold water over the idea, on the grounds that pageants were overdone. With the object of reviving the proposal, Mr. Osborne Aldis of Chester wrote a few days ago to Mr. Edward Compton, who is as famous in New York as he is in Chester, who, writing from the Royal Court Theatre, has replied, "To my mind, there is no city in England which from an historic and architectural point of view could be better selected for such an event. I would be very pleased to allow my name to appear as Director General. I will ask my son to assist me. And if the Masque of Comus can be arranged, my daughter, Miss Violet Compton, would cheerfully take part in the performance." In the event, the pageant committee considered an application made by the well-known theatrical agents, Messrs. Baring Brothers. Edward Baring, who had undertaken major roles in pageants such as the Gloucester pageant in Cheltenham, was appointed to the post of the manager. The Observer, May the 29th, 1909. Osborne writes to the Observer full of enthusiasm, dropping names such as the Dukes of Westminster, who is offering Eaton Hall for the open-air performance of Milton's Comus or other suitable scenes from Shakespeare plays. He writes about timescale, which shouldn't be a problem, and announces that support and cooperation has been promised from the recorder, Sir Horatio Lloyd. There's a spoiler here. Osborne might meet him again very soon. Mr. G. Frost, who with Messrs. James and Roberts are losing no time in forming the committee. He suggests the Mayor and Corporation adopt the passwords of Virgil, the Roman poet, nec mora, nec requies, neither delay nor rest, and that the ancient Chester can rise equal to the occasion. He concludes that thanks of the public are due to Mr. Bode, who at the request of Mr. Compton cheerfully grants the free use of the Royalty Theatre for the performances should the weather prove unpropitious. And in addition, a letter has been received by Mr. Osborne Aldis from Mr. Alfred Mond, ex-Liberal MP, writing from Lowndes Square on Thursday. I shall be very pleased to become one of the committee for the forthcoming pageant at Chester and promote its success by every means in my power. I am pleased to think I have made friends in Chester who will hold me in regard in spite of political differences. The pageant. It could be a subject for another talk, as it's well documented and that it proved a great success. July the 30th, 1910. Letter to the Observer. Sir, if the practical results of the pageant are at all commensurate with the success, for the pageant was a success, let us hope that after payments of all outgoings, they may yet remain a substantial sum, say £1,000, which may form the foundation stone towards the real wants of the community in Chester, in the building of hospital worthy of the city, or perhaps too, it may form an endowment fund for those ill-paid but noble women who really minister by night and by day to the sick and the dying in the tragic drama of real life. Should we do this, we should have no reason to say our revels are ended. These, our actors, as I foretold you, are all spirits, and are melted into air, into thin air. And like the baseless fabric of this vision, the cloud-capped towers, the gorgeous palaces, the solemn temples, the great globe itself, yea, all which inherit, shall dissolve. And like this insubstantial pageant faded, leave not a rack behind. The Tempest, Act 4, Scene 1. The pageant, which ran from July the 18th to the 23rd, made a profit of just £500, 400 which went to the Royal Infirmary and the remaining 100 to the county nursing home. Alas, alas. Then Osborne reverted to the habits of his little life. On the 5th of January 1911, the Cheshire Observer reads, "We understand that the London police today effected the arrest of Mr. Osborne Aldis, a warrant for whose arrest was granted yesterday by Chester City Magistrates. Mr. Aldis will be brought to Chester, it is thought this evening, and will be handed over to the London police to the custody of a Chester officer, and in all probability he will appear before the magistrates on Monday morning. It is understood that the charge upon which he has been arrested relates to his recent bankruptcy proceedings. This led to the magistrate committing Osborne, a well-known resident, for trial, charged with obtaining credit from Browns of Chester, without disclosing he was an undischarged bankrupt. The prosecution alleged that Aldis was twice bankrupt, namely at Bristol and then at Cheltenham. He came to Chester in 1909, residing first at Littleton, then Vickers Cross, D Banks, and later at St John's House. This was demolished in 1958 to make way for half an amphitheatre. And in obtaining the furniture from Browns, he stated falsely he had an income from sons in India. He handed in a written statement which was not read publicly. At the following quarter sessions, Aldis offered the excuse that he had oft expected the sum of £5,000 from his eldest sister, but that unfortunately in her will had been left to the church. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced by Horatio Lloyd, the recorder, to 3 months' imprisonment without hard labour. In October 1914, Osborne applied to Bristol Bankruptcy Court for his discharge, but couldn't attend to ill health. The application included an offer of payment, but this was met with an objection from one of the creditors and was adjourned by the judge. Osborne Aldis died at his home in Chelsea in 1916. He was aged 73. I hope you enjoyed this dip into the life of this lovable rogue. I've touched on Osborne's children. We know that all four girls became nurses. From newspaper cuttings, it is known that Osborne Jr. became a university librarian at the Bodleian and is seen as active along with Huck Gibbs, the first Baron Aldenham, and Thomas Strong, the Bishop of Oxford, helping to purchase rare books, thus stopping their export to America. Charles presumably spent some time in India. There is a record of Charles Aldis sailing from London to Calcutta on the 15th of January 1895 aboard the Danira, and again from London aboard the Matiana on the 18th of January 1908, a journey of 40 days. Perhaps the latter journey followed on from his brief stay at Victoria Pathway. There is also a medal record for a Lieutenant Charles Aldis serving in the Indian Regiment, 1914 to 18. We know a little more about George. At the age of 26, George Vyse Aldis, gentleman, in 1912, set sail for a 36-day journey to the then Calcutta on the ship Mombasa, with 54 passengers and crew. In 1913, George married Dorothy Williams, aged 24. The wedding took place at St John's Church, Calcutta. George became an indigo planter, not the nicest of trades, often forcing the Indian farmers to grow indigo for export as opposed to food for the population. It was, however, the time when the boom in the trade had passed, and so only a trickle of money must have reached England to Osborne. In 1915, while in India, they had a daughter, Dorothea Joan, who was baptised the following year at Motihari. George died in 1938 on Wirral, aged 55. The 1939 register shows his widow, Dorothy Aldis, at 19 Sandley Park, West Kirby, with Frances Daphne, who was born in 1930, listed as a scholar. Dorothy died in Hoylake in 1976.